parchment beneath my trembling hand threatens to blot as I write these words, but I must commit my tale to ink before the darkness consumes me. I am Jareth, once a loyal scholar in the service of Lord Emery of Carsden. I write this not as a chronicle of my duty, but as a warning, a desperate plea to anyone who may find these words. There are places in this world where the shadows are more than a mere absence of light, where the ancient evils that dwell in the dark are not just the stuff of legends. If you ever find yourself at the edge of Eldenwood, turn back. Do not follow the path I took, for if you do, you will find only death and madness. It began with an innocent task, or so it seemed. Lord Emery summoned me to his chambers one stormy evening, the winds howling outside as though the very heavens were warning me of what was to come. He was a stern man, with a face etched by years of rule. There was a certain dread in his eyes that I had never seen before. "Jareth," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have a task for you. A task of utmost importance. I need you to venture into Eldenwood, to the ruins of Kael's Hollow. There you will find a tome, a book that has been lost to time, a relic of the ancient world. I must have it." I hesitated. Eldenwood was a place of dark repute, a forest where few dared to tread. Stories of disappearances, of strange creatures that lurked within, had circulated for generations. "My lord, is this book worth the risk? The tales of Eldenwood." Lord Emery silenced me with the wave of his hand. "The tales are just that, tales. Superstitions of peasants. You are a scholar, a man of reason. I expect you to act as such. Retrieve the book, and you will be greatly rewarded. Fail me, and..." His voice trailed off, but the threat was clear. I had no choice. I bowed my head and agreed to the task, though my heart was heavy with foreboding. I set out the next morning, the sky still gray and oppressive, as if the storm had left a permanent mark upon the world. The path to Eldenwood was long and arduous, winding through barren fields and desolate villages, where the inhabitants dared not speak of the forest. Those I encountered gave me looks of pity or fear, as though they knew my fate was sealed. I was not alone on this journey. Lord Emery had assigned me a guide, a man named Gideon. He was a rugged hunter, his face scarred from battles with both beast and man. He spoke little, but his presence was reassuring, a reminder that I was not completely without protection. "Eldenwood is not like other forests," Gideon said on the second day of our journey. We had stopped at the edge of a clearing, the dense trees of the forests looming ahead like wall of shadow. "The trees there, they seem to watch you. The animals, they don't behave as they should. It's as if the whole place is cursed." "Cursed?" I scoffed, trying to hide my unease with skepticism. Surely you don't believe in such nonsense." Gideon met my gaze, his eyes hard. "I've seen things, Jareth. Things that can't be explained by reason. You do well to keep your wits about you." We pressed on, entering the forest as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the thick canopy, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. The air grew colder, the sounds of the outside world fading into an eerie silence. The trees were ancient, their gnarled roots twisting like bones of the earth, and the underbrush was thick with brambles that seemed to snag at our clothes like grasping fingers. As we ventured deeper, I began to notice strange things. The trees, as Gideon had warned, did seem to watch us, their knotted trunks and twisted branches forming grotesque faces that leered from the darkness. The animals, when they appeared, were not the timid creatures of the ordinary woods, but large, silent things with glowing eyes that observed us from the shadows before vanishing without a sound. By the third day I was thoroughly unnerved. We had seen no sign of the ruins, and the forest seemed to grow denser with each passing hour, the path narrowing until it was little more than a trail of beaten earth widening through the oppressive gloom. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and every breath felt heavy in my chest. "We shall be close now," Gideon said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He paused, studying the ground. "There, do you see it?" I followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The undergrowth had been disturbed. The earth churned as though something large had passed through. But it was not the tracks of an animal. The prints were deep, elongated, almost human, but too large, with long, clawed toes that dug into the earth. "What could have made those?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Gideon shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know, but we should be cautious. Stay close." We continued on, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional rustle in the bushes. As the sun began to set, casting the forest in an eerie twilight, we finally reached the ruins of Kael's Hollow. The ruins were a bleak and desolate place, the remains of ancient stone structures long since overrun by the forest. Vines and moss covered the crumbling walls, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. The trees here were older, their twisted branches arching over the ruins like skeletal fingers blocking out what little light remained. "This is it," Gideon said, his voice low. "Kael's Hollow. Stay alert. We don't know what might be lurking here." We moved cautiously through the ruins, our eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The place felt wrong, as if the very air was charged with some unseen force. I could feel it pressing down on me, heavy, malevolent, a presence that seemed to seep from the stones themselves. "Over here," Gideon called, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I followed him to what appeared to be the remains of a large hall, the walls partially collapsed and covered in thick ivy. In the center of the hall was a stone pedestal, and on it rested a large, ancient tome. It was bound in black leather, the cover cracked and worn, and the pages yellowed with age. "This must be the book," I said, my voice trembling as I reached out to touch it. But as my fingers brushed the cover, a cold shock ran through me, as if I had touched ice. I recoiled, my heart pounding. What is this?" Gideon frowned, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "I don't like this. We should take it and leave. Quickly." I nodded, but as I reached for the book again, a sound echoed through the ruins, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around us. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and I could feel the presence closing in, watching us from the darkness. "We're not alone," Gideon whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows. Before I could respond, the growl grew louder, more intense, and the shadows began to move. From the darkness emerged figures, tall and thin, their skin pale as death, their eyes glowing with malevolent red light. They moved with unnatural grace, their feet barely touching the ground as they circled us. "Vampires," Gideon hissed, drawing his sword. "Get behind me!" I stumbled back, clutching the book to my chest as Gideon raised his blade. The vampires were upon us in an instant. their movements a blur. Gideon swung his sword, the blade slicing through the air, but it was as if they anticipated his every move. One of them darted forward, its claws raking across his arm, leaving deep, bloody gashes. Gideon cried out, staggering back as more of the creatures closed in. I could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that we were outmatched. But he fought on, slashing at the vampires as they circled us, their eyes glowing with hunger. "We have to get out of here," I shouted, backing towards the entrance of the ruins. But the vampires were relentless. One of them lunged at me, its fangs bared. I raised the book in a desperate attempt to shield myself. As the creature's claws touched the tome, it recoiled with a hiss, as though burned. "The book!" I shouted to Gideon. "It's afraid of the book!" Gideon glanced at me, his eyes narrowing. "Keep it close. We need to make a break for it." With a final, desperate swing of his sword, Gideon cleared a path through the vampires, and we ran. The creatures pursued us, their hisses filling the air, but they kept their distance from the book as if its very presence repelled them. We stumbled out of the ruins and into the forest, the vampires close behind. The trees seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing deeper, but we ran on, driven by sheer terror. The path was uneven, the ground slick with moisture, and I nearly lost my footing several times, but Gideon urged me on, his voice steady despite the fear I knew he must have felt. As we ran, I could feel the presence growing stronger, pressing down on me like a weight. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching us, hunting us. The vampires were merely its agents, the hands of some greater force that lurked in the darkness. Finally, after what felt like hours, we broke through the trees and into a clearing. The moonlight bathed the clearing in a cold, silver light, and for a moment I dared to hope that we had escaped. But then I saw them. Dozens of figures emerging from the forest, their eyes glowing red in the darkness. "We're surrounded," Gideon said, his voice grim. I clutched the book to my chest, my heart pounding. "What do we do?" Gideon glanced at the book, then at the vampires closing in around us. "We fight. We die if we must. But we don't give them the satisfaction of taking us easily." He raised his sword, his stance firm despite the odds. I nodded, though I knew it was hopeless. We were going to die here in this cursed forest at the hand of these creatures. The vampires moved closer, their eyes fixed on the book. I could see their fangs, long and sharp, glinting in the moonlight. They were savoring the moment, enjoying our fear, our desperation. But then, something strange happened. The book in my hands began to grow warm, the leather covering almost pulsing beneath my fingers. I looked down and saw the symbol on the covers were glowing with a faint, eerie light. "What is this?" I muttered, more to myself than to Gideon. The vampires hesitated, their eyes narrowing as they watched the book. The warmth grew stronger, and the light from the symbols grew brighter, until it was almost blinding. "Jareth, what's happening?" Gideon asked, his voice edged with panic. "I don't know," I cried. The light's now seeping between my fingers, enveloping my hands in a warm, golden glow. The vampires recoiled, their hissing turned to screeching of pain as the light touched them. They tried to retreat, but the light was relentless, growing brighter and brighter until it filled the entire clearing. And then, with a deafening roar, the light exploded outward, consuming the vampires in a blinding flash. I felt a heat wash over me, and then nothing. When I awoke, I was lying on the ground, the warmth of the sun on my face. I blinked, disoriented, and slowly sat up. The clearing was empty, the forest quiet and still. There was no sign of the vampires, no sign of the light that had saved us. "Gideon!" I called, my voice weak. There was no answer. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, looking around frantically. But Gideon was nowhere to be found. The only trace of him was his sword lying in the grass where he had stood. I was alone. For a moment I simply stood there, overwhelmed by a wave of despair. But then I remembered the book. I looked down and saw it lying on the ground beside me, its cover now dark and lifeless. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The warmth was gone, and the symbols were no longer glowing. But the book had saved me, that much was clear. Somehow, it had repelled the vampires, driven them away. But at what cost? I didn't know. I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get out of Eldenwood, had to return to Carsden and deliver the book to Lord Emery. Perhaps he would have the answers. Perhaps he would know what to do. But first, I had to survive. The journey back through the forest was a blur. I moved quickly, fear driving me on. The book clutched tightly to my chest. The forest seemed less oppressive now, the shadows less deep, but I didn't trust it. The darkness here was ancient, patient. It could be waiting, watching, ready to strike when I least expected it. When I finally emerged from the trees and saw the familiar walls of Carsden in the distance, I nearly wept with relief, but there was no time for tears, no time for rest. I had to see Lord Emery, had to give him the book before it was too late. The guards at the gate recognized me and allowed me to pass, though they looked at me with a mixture of fear and pity, as if they could see the horrors I had faced in Eldenwood. I paid them no mind, my thoughts focused solely on reaching Lord Emery. When I was finally ushered into his chamber, the Lord looked up from his desk, his eyes widening in surprise.
Jareth, you've returned, and you have the book.
I nodded, unable to speak as I handed it to him. He took it eagerly, his hands almost trembling with anticipation as he opened the cover.
Did you have any trouble?
He asked, not looking up from the tome. I hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had happened. There were creatures, my lord, vampires. They attacked us, but the book, it saved me. It drove them away. Lord Emery glanced up, his expression unreadable.
The book drove them away, you say?
Yes, my lord, it emitted a light that repelled them. I don't know how, but it protected me. Lord Emery's eyes narrowed as he closed the book with a soft thud.
Interesting.
I waited for him to say more, but he simply stared at the book, his expression distant. Finally, I couldn't stand the silence any longer. What is it, my lord? What does the book contain? He looked up at me, his eyes cold.
Power, Jareth. It contains power. The power to control the darkness, to bend it to one's will, to command the creatures of the night.
My heart skipped a beat. Command them? You mean you knew about the vampires? Lord Emery smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a chill down my spine.
Of course. Eldenwood is my domain, after all. I know everything that happens there.
You sent me there, knowing what awaited me?
I needed the book, Jareth, he said, as if that explained everything. You were the only one I could trust to retrieve it.
I took a step back, my mind reeling. You used me.
Yes, he said simply. And you succeeded. Now, thanks to you, I have the power I need.
The realization hit me like a physical blow. Lord Emery had sent me into that cursed forest, knowing full well the dangers that awaited me, all to retrieve a book of dark magic. And now that he had it, what would he do? What horrors would he unleash upon the world? I won't let you, I began, but Lord Emery cut me off with a wave of his hand.
You won't do anything, Jareth. Your role in this is finished. You should be grateful I even allowed you to return.
His words sent a surge of anger through me, but I knew there was nothing I could do. He was the Lord, and I was just a scholar, a pawn in his game. I could only hope that somehow someone would stop him before it was too late. Without another word, I turned and left the chamber, my heart heavy with the knowledge of the horrors that were to come. I tried to leave Carsden that very night, but it was too late. The castle was already under siege, though not by an army of men. The creatures I had encountered in Eldenwood had followed me, drawn by the power of the book, by the scent of the dark magic that Lord Imry now wielded. I could hear their howls in the night, the screeches of the vampires as they prowled the castle walls, searching for a way in. The guards were terrified, their swords useless against these creatures. And then the screams began. It started in the lower quarters, the servants' wing. The vampires had found their way inside. I could hear the terror in their voices, the desperation as they were dragged into the darkness, their blood staining the cold stone floors. The scent of death filled the air, and the once proud castle of Carsden was reduced to a slaughterhouse. I fled to the library, the only place where I felt safe, surrounded by the knowledge of the ancients. But even there I could not escape the sounds of the massacre. The screams echoed through the halls, growing louder, closer, until I could hear them just outside the door. I barricaded myself in, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they found me. The vampires were relentless, driven by a hunger that could not be sated, and I knew deep down that this was my doing. I had brought this upon Carsden. I had unleashed the darkness. As I sit here writing these final words, I can hear them outside the door, the scratching of their claws on the wood, the hissing of their breath as they sniff out my scent. I know they'll find me, that it is only a matter of time before they'll break through and drag me into the darkness with the others. But I must finish this. I must warn whoever may find these words, though I fear it is already too late. Lord Imry has the book, and with it, the power to command these creatures of the night. He will stop at nothing to achieve his goal, and the world will drown in blood and darkness if he's not stopped. If you're reading this, know that the darkness is rising. Vampires are but the first of many horrors that will be unleashed upon the world, and all of it, all of the death and destruction, began with me.